At dawn, Neil, sleeping in the back of the old wheelhouse area, was half awakened by something. Lying on his back, he had the vague feeling of still being in a dream. He was disorientated. In the dream he'd been lying where he was lying now, but Jim had been at the helm, and another figure, also himself it seemed, was seated a few feet away on the port settee. The third figure in the wheelhouse was both himself and an intruder, and he struggled in his half-awakened state to determine who the other person was. In the dream, the figure began to take on a more ominous emotional significance. Neil began to have that nightmarish feeling of struggling to awaken himself in order to deal with the impending danger. He sat overgrown, awake at last. Jim was standing at the helm, as in his dream, and to his left, seated with characteristic calm, was the thick, compact figure of Conrad Macklin. He was sipping a cup of tea. For a brief moment, Neil felt himself back in the dream, then realised with a sinking feeling that he was facing reality. Conrad Macklin was back on board. He looked steadily at Macklin, who gazed back without expression. "Would you like some hot tea?" Macklin asked. "Where did you come from?" Neil finally asked. "I never really left," Macklin answered. "I stowed away in some kind of storage area up front." "How did you get back on board?" "Swam out, most underwater, right after you put me ashore," Macklin replied. "Pulled myself up on the anchor line while you were loading the last bunch onto the dinghy." Neil continued to stare at Macklin coldly, then released a long sigh. "A man is wounded," he said. "I suppose you'd better take a look at him." "Good," said Macklin. "I doubt it," said Neil. An hour later, awake but with his eyes closed, he realised that all night long, even before the dream, something had been missing. Something he ought to be feeling but was not. Vagabond was cutting cleanly through blue waters. Dead ahead, the sunlight sparkled like diamonds on the whitecaps. He had escaped to sea. The horrors of the land were receding. At such times he should feel elated. But he didn't. Something inside him must be telling him that this time there was no escape. The tentacles of land had reached out, and even now lay heavily on his deck. He was at sea, but that 98% lump of earth called man was still with him. Long Voyage Back, Rheinhart, 1983, Part 2, Ashes. The moon, now almost 3/4 full, lit up the sea to port like a giant nightlight. It was after midnight, and Neil had enjoyed the last hour more than any since he'd fled the cheesesteak 3 days before. Vagabond was now rushing through the night at 11 or 12 knots, and Neil was feeling the exhilaration that only a sailboat tearing through the sea at night could give him. Behind were 3 trails of phosphorescent white, bubbling out so fast it seemed Vagabond must be doing 20 knots, no matter what the speedometer said. Ahead, Neil could see almost nothing. The trimaran charged into the blackness, as if it was totally confident that nothing could halt her queenly progress. They were now about 100 miles east of North Carolina coast, and Neil held his course at due south by lining up the cluster of stars that made Orion's belt with the port shroud. He had let Jim and Lisa, whose official watcher was, continue sleeping rather than wake them for their midnight to 3 a.m. watch. Vagabond, plunging forward through the night, was just on the edge of being over-canvassed, and Neil kept checking to feel if the wind was getting too strong for the sail area. So far it hadn't, and part of his joy arose from feeling that he, Vagabond, the wind and the sea were in total harmony. With moderate seas he'd been able to adjust the mizzen so that the Vagabond was steering herself. He could wander out of the wheelhouse into either cockpit to stare at the stars or watch the moonlight on the sea, and Vagabond, like a giant puppy unleashed and glorying in a midnight romp, hurtled forward by herself through the night. At moments like this she seemed to be human, and he loved her, urged her on in his mind, congratulated her when, after an errant wave had pushed her bow off course, her mizzen slowly pushed her stern around to get her back on course. All the troubles of the day were flushing away in Vagabond's bubbling wake. Although the familiar grey cloud masses which had seemed to be permanently pursuing them had dissipated 2 days earlier, Neil, Frank and Ollie had all suffered from radiation sickness. Frank was still nauseous after 3 days, and Ollie still suffered from diarrhea. Although the men had told the others it was seasickness, they all knew that none of them ever got seasick except in exceptionally heavy seas. Neil himself had been queasy for 2 days, and once, only he knew it had happened, vomited off the afterdeck. His sickness frightened and depressed him, but on this 3rd day it appeared to be gone. In addition, listening to reports of the war had been a depressing and divisive experience. Although a Pentagon spokesman that morning had made a vague report about the great devastation that had been wreaked upon the Soviet Union, about a decisive naval victory in the Indian Ocean, about the grudging way Allied forces were giving ground in what was left of Europe, the idea that the US might win the war seemed irrelevant in the face of a report that most of the population east of Cleveland, north of Philadelphia, and south of Boston was fleeing from the effects of the war. Lack of food, water, electricity, and the reality and fear of radioactive fallout. It was implied that half the northeast might soon be uninhabitable for all except a tenth of its former population. Other sections of the country were equally endangered. How people were evacuated when all the fuel was requisitioned by the military and the public transportation network had ceased to exist was not explained. "They're jogging," Frank had commented, not mentioning that his wife and daughter might still be alive and among the fleeing millions. Neil wandered back into the cockpit to adjust the drag on the trolling rig that had been jammed there. Although they had rarely hooked anything at night, especially at 10 knots, Neil had asked Ollie to try. As he set the drag and checked the tension, he remembered that it was Jean who had finally gotten them out of their oppressive mood. Earlier that evening she had browbeaten them into a sing-along. It had started out as a funeral dirge, but ended with a giddy silliness. Captain Ollie taught them a blatantly obscene sea chanty, and although Lisa blushed, little Skippy sang along loudly and triggered the last burst of laughter by announcing that he liked songs about pussies. Pressing the rod back into place, Neil smiled at the memory. The world of the last several days had been one of emotional somersault alternating with delights of sailing or of eating their meagre meals or bringing in a fish. He wished he could control the lows. In the cheap spate they'd endured seemingly hourly threats to their survival, but now, 90 miles from land, he felt it was his task to create for them a new world of order, routine and dependability. As he came back to lean against the entrance of Frank's cabin and look forward, he thought of his watch teams. Frank and Tony, Ollie and Macklin, and Jim and Lisa were now working out well. At first he had tried Tony with Ollie, figuring Ollie might need Tony's extra strength, but it hadn't worked. Tony was a huge athletic man of 28, outgoing, ebullient, used to running things, a former football star and successful salesman. He'd had trouble getting along with Ollie. Although Ollie never appeared to order Tony around, he had assumed control of the vagabond as naturally as he had of the Lucy May. He treated Tony as a minor tool, a winch handle perhaps, and didn't tend to listen when the winch handle talked back. Once, when Tony finished a brilliant analysis of why loosening the Genoa sheet and altering course 3 degrees had increased their speed at half a knot, Ollie responded with a brief silence, a puff on his unlit pipe, and the suggestion that Tony should tighten up on the Genoa a bit and alter the course 3 degrees back again. At the end of their first day at sea, Tony had taken Frank aside to complain. "The old guy's senile," he said when they were off in the port cockpit after Ollie had retired into the aft cabin to nap. "I don't think he relates to people anymore." "Only when he wants to," Frank replied. He spent an hour on watch today talking about the various positions he used when he was screwing his third wife, claimed there were 27 and started mumbling and swearing when he could only remember 22. Frank smiled. "You get a free stand-up comic every watch," he said. "I don't want a stand-up comic," Tony exploded. "I want to talk to someone who speaks English." "I'll take it up with Neil," Frank said. "Why the hell can't you change the watches?" Tony went on. "You own the boat, don't you?" "I own it," replied Frank evenly. "And Neil is captain. I'll speak to him." "Let me work with you," Tony said. "Macklin's exactly the quiet sort that Ollie will love." "You're probably right," Frank had said, smiling, and when he had reported the conversation, Neil had laughed and changed the watch teams as suggested. Jim and Lisa were an unexpected gift. Lisa hopped around the boat with the nimbleness of a cat, and though she had to be reminded to wear a life jacket when she went forward to change the sail, she otherwise followed orders quickly and well. Intensely serious most of the time, she seemed to glow when working with Jim, as if the physical work liberated her from her seriousness. For a moment Neil was brought out of his reverie by the appearance of a light off the port bow, but he decided it was just the moonlight reflecting off a distant white cap. He wandered from the starboard cockpit through the wheelhouse with its unintended wheel to the port side to get a better look and to take a piss off the afterdeck. As he approached, he was startled to see a head and shoulders silhouetted against the reflection of the moonlight. It was Jean's profile, silent and motionless compared to the swirling, rushing roller coaster ride of vagabond through the ocean. He stopped and noticed a few feet away from her and looked with her out over the water. The night breeze stirred her long hair away from her face. "Oh," she said, turning her head as she became aware of his presence. "Incredible, isn't it?" he asked softly. She turned away to look out at the river of moonlight that sparkled across the ocean, flowing towards him from the east. "Yes," she said. Neil stood close behind her, steadying himself with his right arm on the wheelhouse roof and smiling, in love with Vagabond, the sea, the night, and the moon. "Who's steering?" Jean asked, turning briefly back to him, her face in darkness with the back to the moon. "Vagabond," he answered. "She told me she wanted to handle things herself for a while." Jean rose slightly to stare past him at the wheelhouse and saw the unattended wheel. Then she looked at the sails aft and at the 3 white rivers of light bubbling out behind them. Finally she looked back at Neil. "Amazing," she said. "As long as there's wind, sails and sea, the world won't all be bad," he said. "For you," she commented. "For me," he quietly agreed. "I'm still not comfortable out here," she said. "The idea that there's a mile of water beneath me and no dry land within 100 miles is a little terrifying. I'm sorry." "If it weren't a little terrifying," Neil replied after a pause, "it wouldn't be so beautiful." She also took some time before replying. "For a while I thought you weren't emotional about anything," she said. "I guess I'm not, except about the sea. Millions can die, and the good wind cures all," she said, not sarcastically but rather questioningly, as if trying to understand him. "If I can't save the millions," Neil replied cautiously, "then I'm willing to enjoy a good wind." "But what if you can?" she countered. "And I'd like to know how." She turned away and stared out in the blackness. "No, the millions are lost," she finally said. "And I have to admit you're good at saving single digits."